This video is about the generate macro operator. This operator creates macros using expressions containing a mixture of function calls, mathematical operations, and the values of other macros. The operator allows macros to be manipulated with a lot of flexibility to match the needs of the process that you're creating. We'll cover firstly other places where macros can be created. Generate macro isn't the only operator. There are other things that can create macros. However, the most important is generate macro. So we'll then look at the parameters to this operator, such as the function descriptions parameter, and really the most important things in that are functions and macros. And we'll also look at the use standard constants parameter. So here's a very simple process. Now it has two generate macro operators, but it also has two other operators. The first is unset macro and the second is set macros. These two on the left here are other operators that can be used to change macros in some way. You'll notice, by the way, that there's no example set. In general, you don't need an example set. You can just generate macros without them. So to make life simple, I haven't included an example set at all. So anyway, let's quickly look at unset macro. Now this is merely a tidying operator really. This lets you delete a macro. And this can be important if you have a very complex process where a macro has been created somewhere else and you want to be sure that it's been deleted before you recreate it for some other reason. I've seen processes where macros can essentially be passed between different parts of a complex process and mistakes happen. So by using unset, you can be sure that it's been deleted. The default behavior for RapidMiner Studio is to delete all macros anyway as soon as a process starts. So it's very unlikely you'll need it, but you just need to be aware that it's there if you need it. The second one here is called set macros. There's also one called set macro without the plural. If I go to the operator view, you can see here there are several macro related operators. So set macros is a way of creating macros, and it's basically the same as generate macro. There are some very subtle differences. So we'll simply create two macros here, and when we get to the generate macro operator, we'll refer back to these and we can see the subtle differences. Okay. Now then, let's look at the first generate macro operator. So basically there are two parameters: function descriptions, where all the detail is, and use standard constants. We'll quickly get rid of use standard constants. In my experience, it makes no difference what this does, so we should just ignore it and set it to true. Okay, function descriptions. I click on this button here. You will now see the dialog for function descriptions, and this is where you create macros and give expressions to dictate how they're created. On the left, the macro names. On the right, some rules to create them. And there are 7 macros here with a variety of numbers and strings and so on. In addition, there's a second generate macro operator here which has 8 macros in it, and this is actually using some of the macros in the previous operator. So here's the first thing to know, that unlike generate attributes, where you can use an attribute that's been created later on in the same operator, generate macro doesn't work like that. You have to create any macro in another operator or in another location, and once you've done that, then you can use it inside a subsequent generate macro operation. That's essentially what's happening here. So what I'll do is, if I run this process, we will go through these macros one by one and see how they're being created and see what the results look like. So I've created a view here. What we can do is we can click on various processes, look at the parameters, and you'll notice that the macro window here shows the results. So let's look at set macros first. If you remember, that's like generate macro. There are some subtle differences, ever so subtle. So I'm going to now click on the equivalent of the function descriptions for that, and you'll see there's a macro called setMacro1, there's another one called setMacro2, and I've set it, the first one, to my attribute without quotes, and the second one includes quotes. If we look for here, the two macros are here, and you notice setMacro1 simply is a faithful reproduction of whatever I entered here. The same is true for setMacro2. Now remember that, use your memories, and if I now go to generate macro, click on the edit list button, you'll see generate macro 1, generate macro 2. Notice I've put quotes around generate macro 1. If I go over to here, you'll note the quotes have been stripped off. To get quotes to appear around the value, I actually have to escape them with a backslash and a quote. So you can see a backslash and a quote, a backslash and a double quote rather, and by doing that I can get the value of generate macro 2 to include double quotes. That's the main difference I've found between set macros and generate macro, but to all intents and purposes generate macro does everything and is in fact the one to use. So what we'll do now, we'll continue down these macros. This is in the first generate macro operator. So we've covered the first two. Now numeric counter, I've set this to the value 1. The next one is large example string. I've put this in quotes and I've called it this is a large string containing the number 42 to show how the text functions work. So when we get there you'll see what I'm going to manipulate this string. The next one is actually a regular expression, so it contains a dot asterisk the dot asterisk in double quotes. I'm going to use this as a string, a regular expression string, to try and find something. Name prefix, that's just I'm going to name some macros using this, and here's a complex number, I, the square root of -1. You might be somewhat pleased to learn that you can actually put complex numbers in macros. So we'll deal with these one by one. Firstly, numeric counter, there it is. I'm going to play with this later in the subsequent generate macro. I'm going to increment this by 2. So before I've called the second generate macro operator, numeric counter had the value 1. If I'd set a breakpoint on this, you would see it set to 1. Large example string, there it is. This is a large string containing the number 42. Note there are no quotes around it. That's okay. The next one, match string. So where are we? There it is. That's dot asterisk with the in between. So that's just been faithfully reproduced. Begin, fairly straightforward begin. And complex number, you might be somewhat intrigued to see 0, 1. So that's the real part is 0 and the imaginary part is 1. So this is something I stumbled on the other day. So it's quite nice, but not actually that useful. Okay, so now we'll get into the real work. Let's look at the second generate macro operator. This starts to manipulate the macros that I had created earlier. So firstly, numeric counter. Now if you remember, numeric counter was set to 1. Now to use a macro you have to put % open squiggly bracket the name, close squiggly, and then I'm using +1 to add 1 to that numeric counter. Now because numeric counter originally had a 1 in it, it's okay to add another 1 to it. So essentially I'm incrementing numeric counter, and as you can see the result is 2. So that's working. Now if numeric counter had been a string, then that would have failed in some way. So generally speaking, macros and the types that the macros have is usually fairly well behaved and fairly obvious and easy to use. So in this case, because I'd set numeric counter to 1, then it's going to work properly. The second one, Boolean value. So if we find it here, Boolean value there is true. So 1 double equals 1. This is an expression and it's saying 1 double equals 1, well, that's true. So I'm asserting that 1 is 1, and the result of that is the Boolean value true. So the macro now takes on the value true. Next one, make a string. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking using the str function, which is if I click on this button here, you get to see all of the functions that are available, and I'm using one from the text group. Str, if I put my mouse over that and leave it, it says transforms the number into a string. So essentially what this does is take a number, in this case a numeric counter, notice it's not in quotes because it's a number, converts 1 to a 1 string, and it adds on a. Now that plus in this context means concatenate. Prove that to you, go back to here, text concat. If I leave my mouse over that for a while, you'll notice that it says there the plus operator can also be used for this. So plus and concat are the same operation. It's a bit easier to read plus, I suppose. Anyway, the result of 1 plus a is, there it is, make a string 1a. Very good. Next, number from within a string. Now, this is again using a function. It's called replace all. I'll go and look at it. Here it is. Text replace all. So what this does, it takes 2 arguments and, I beg your pardon, 3 arguments. So the first one is the attribute. Now it isn't an attribute, it's the macro. Then it's the regular expression to use to do the matching, and then the final expression is the thing to replace with. Okay, so what I've got in this situation, I've got replace within the macro called large example string, so that whenever I find anything that's not a number, so this is what this syntax means, open square bracket hat, little up arrow thing, that means negate the following. It's basically saying anything that's not a number is a match, and I'm replacing it with nothing. So if you remember, the original large example string had this in it. So this is a large string, da da da. The only number in it is number 42. So sure enough, we're expected to see number from within a string. There it is, 42. The answer to everything. Next one. String contains another. So this is a use of the matches function. Click here. Text matches. It's basically, again, it's 2 arguments, the second of which is a regular expression. So what I'm doing here is using 2 macros. I'm trying to find within the large example string a match string. Now the match string is this regular expression here, and the large example string is this large one here. Now, as you can see, it definitely contains the value the. So if I were to run this, I would get the answer true. String contains another. There it is. Okay, next one. So here's an example of a macro being created from the values of other macros. Some subtle points here. Firstly, it looks like we're trying to create a macro, first part is whose name is based on another macro value. Now this macro doesn't exist, can't find it in this list. What happens? Basically it gets turned into just that text. So the behavior is, if this macro doesn't exist, the result is begin. Then there's underscore. This can be any character, so simply concatenated with that. The next one is numeric counter. Now this does exist. It has the value 2. Note at the end of this operator. At the beginning of this operator it had the value 1. Therefore, it seems to be that the way this works is that it will use a value of the macro at the beginning of the operator before it's been manipulated, as you can see in this row here. The result of this expression is essentially begin underscore 1, and you can see here's a macro called begin underscore 1, and it's being set to a value, as you can see. So here's an example of another macro which is using some of the date functions as well as the if function. Quickly look at the date functions. Here they are. We're going to cover the date struct custom, which is this one, and date now, which is this one. In addition, there's miscellaneous functions. There's a function called if, which gives different results depending on whether the expression to be evaluated is true or false. So anyway, what's happening here is we're saying, okay, date now, that returns now, the date and time now, and we're parsing this to make a string. Those expert in the art of Java date time format will know that A means AM or PM. So if the time when you run this is in the morning, this whole thing, this date struct custom, will evaluate to AM. If it's the afternoon, it will evaluate to PM. So this if then is comparing the result to AM or PM. If it's AM, then the result of the whole if is morning. If it's PM, the result of the whole if is afternoon. So the macro will therefore be set to, part of the day will be set to, well, in my case I run it this afternoon, so afternoon is correct. Finally, operator parameter. This is just a relatively advanced thing where you can actually look at the parameters to various other operators in your process. And I'm also using the escape HTML function which neatens up this. So there is a process called generate macro 2. It's in fact this one here. And you can determine various parameters that have been set against this operator. And param will essentially return those to you. So anyway, the result of running this is this string here. What I'll do is if I copy that into a text editor of some sort. Here's a text editor. If you look at that long enough, you can convince yourself that that actually matches the function descriptions edit box. You should know that that means is a field separator and this is a line separator. So you can sort of see numeric counters being set to the value 2, which I'm taking to mean the value of another macro plus 1, which is a direct constant. Anyway, this is merely for showing really the sort of things you can get up to if you really have to. I don't recommend this for the early starter. This is something to do when you're really getting into complex things. So in conclusion then, I'll bring up the main dialog for the function descriptions operator and just leave that there so that you can see a final view of how various functions map to results.